Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman protectores from the 3rd to the 5th century AD, the emperor favorites in some ways. Bit of an obscure set of officers we will see now that in fact also had different functions over the centuries. That, however, deserve a lot of attention next to the Scole Palatine and other elite forces in late Roman warfare. So let's get just to the definition, because also the context requires that. So we know more or less the period in which the protectores came around. During the 3rd century, in particular the latter part of it, we witness a replacement of the members of the senatorial order with individuals of equestrian rank in the highest positions of military hierarchies. This phenomenon rapidly grew in parallel with the emergence of this figure known as the protector, in plural protectores, that thus would signify the affirmation of some officiality not drawn from the more traditional cursus honorum that, as we've seen in some videos about the early Roman imperial chain of command, sharing essentially like this intense military career during the first steps of the ladder in the earlier age, in order to become an official of mostly civilian function, even though at some point, of course, endowed with imperium. After the 3rd century crisis, instead, you have rulers that are, as you know, increasingly drawn directly from within the ranks, the comitatus of the single general slash usurper slash emperor that had come to power through the same arms at a point, stressing, of course, the personal connection, the clienterly, in fact, dependence, and the general, let's say, prowess in a strictly military sense, someone that could be reliable in terms of a career that would remain mostly one of military activity, regardless of course, the more civilian positions that could be achieved at some point. But as we know, in spite of the fact that the empire restabilizes in the latter part of the 3rd century, it would remain much more militarized, also bureaucratic, exactly to maintain more relentless military activity for protecting, in fact, territory, the security of which had deteriorated, especially on the frontier, and that had to be always checked and controlled and preserved. So this is a broader dynamic that, of course, doesn't have only to do with the protectores. This has to do with what we call the Constantinian reform, essentially the incredibly successful late Roman army from the time of Constantine up to Adrianople, fundamentally. That was, in this sense, also the most tactically developed that Rome ever fielded, and that, in fact, does not leave as long as the protectores themselves. However, mirroring the fact that such privileged individuals, ever more tied also to the imperial household, was ever more in need of such loyal military officials for the rule of the empire. As we will see in this video, there is a tendency towards what, in fact, had already been affirmed from the 3rd to 4th century as at least some characters within the Roman army, and the segmentation of the troops, the increasing value of a narrower, numerically, but also greater qualitatively elite compared to the rest of essentially of the army that was ever more made up of levies, and an empire that is gradually shrinking, especially in the West. I made a video about the Roman army of the the Western Roman army of the 5th century to highlight exactly this, so that even in the most difficult times of both the Western and the Eastern halves of the empire, because to a degree they followed very similar trends, just one survived, the others didn't, but critical situations were out there. Such, again, defense and militarization properly of the imperial household, and the fortification of the capitals, the reliance on such elite and the capacity from the center to rule the periphery as well, with an increasingly rigid hierarchy, was out there. It's something that preludes to feudal warfare to a degree. We'll see now also how the actual fealty was worn in ways that would have been unthinkable for a Roman emperor of the 1st century, and that now instead we're sharing actually a lot with what become, you can see also in the Germanic world, for example, as in others, a bit like the tendency of de facto vassalic elite of some sort, but with higher quality and responsibility. That's where the protectores fit fundamentally. These individuals constituted, and it's not easy to quite define them in such a fixed way, but say a sort of estate of officers selected from the most capable elements within the lower ranks. All right. Therefore, for actual merit and or particular connections, and that were intended to operate in virtue of such trust and reliability within the emperor's general staff, a role of increasing importance during the period when the Augusti were almost constantly in the field, leading their mobile armies. We're talking with heterarchy here, so we're looking at emperors that are truly ruling just 1/4 of the empire. The other half is the Caesars, and as you know, these are meant to succeed one another in their respective halves. The system will not sort of take off really successfully, but actually it opened to another phase of civil wars in which all these rulers were heavily involved in for life, essentially, military struggle, needing such qualified staff made up of the best officers within the army that thus seemed promising, that had shown particular capabilities, and could, as we'll see better now, surpass even the actual cursus that was established, like, hierarchically rising up through all the various ranks, one after the other, and sort of skipping this because of particular value. Naturally, we could not really talk about this hadn't we made, and wouldn't we make, hopefully, many more videos on the late Roman army. I mean, I surely will. I mean, just if I die, I won't. But that's the point. Because as you know, this force was becoming even bigger. Like at least as we was pointing out before, for the extension of military service to individuals that historically had lived in a much more pacific society, and now, even when settled in some previously secure parts of the periphery, now had to provide with some military service for the defense of the communities and so on. So there is an enormous debate, as you know, historically, for defining how many troops just the Roman military could rely on. Consider that now the empire came to be separated into two administrative halves, and so there were different systems developing in parallel. We've seen from the Notitia Dignitatum the complexity of what was not even necessarily the actual and full, especially, picture of the Roman military in the various times in which the notizia is actually coming from, because as you know, it was two or more pieces put together from different places and times. The survival of early units, right, legions from Caesar's times that we find in the time of Justinian's numeration still of such the same units, of how they had developed over time, the introduction of others, the introduction of the federati. So it's a total mess, and that's also the reason why we have to make one video at a time explaining this, because otherwise we can't literally get out of there alive. So the protectores are definitely sort of lesser known estate of officiality that, however, had very peculiarly important and effective functions we will illustrate now. The origins of the protectores seem to date back to around the mid-3rd century. So in the moment in which things had started becoming unhinged, also in terms of the territorial compaction of the empire, thus also of the military that depended on such lands and was provided by the same, thus creating like an emergential situation. Recently we talked about, for example, Trebonianus Gallus. So the necessity of putting together forces that, by the way, are not simply just recruitable from within the same system as before, because more or less the individuals, everybody has been Romanized, and not many are as interested as before to professionally become career military men. And these protectores are evidently the product of a situation that needs to rely on the best elements within this also ever more heterogeneous group, where you can, however, select the single talents and bringing them on the floor. The protectores typically came from the centurionate, the primipilate. So we're talking about the lowest level of officialty, although one that had to do with the actual command of troops in combat, right, and at the highest level of the legion, or held a tribunate that thus had involved the command of pretty sizable forces just above that lower rank, and were designated for command within a legion or even a higher level tribunate. I made a video about the tribunes. We talked a bit about the Roman army across the centuries, but we have still to do a lot on these figures. We have interesting sources such as epigraphs from the mid-3rd century highlighting the position of protector as a preliminary role leading to that of legion commander. Legions were also gradually reducing in size from a while. The nature of the Roman military organics was becoming really fluid at this point. However, these people were selected from the officers that had, in fact, the greater experience at that level of command, reflecting such new organic needs. Often, the protectores were destined for remarkably high-ranking careers. They were essentially spotted as the more reliable soldiers, the more reliable professionals, as we've seen in parallel to an increase in distrust towards the senatorial families that had historically now gentrified and preferred to live more distantly from the turbulent and ever more turbulent military frontiers, from which, incidentally, in fact, the new leadership was coming from, and exactly from a military background. So as we will see, so when this system will fully institutionalize in the army, that even important emperors had once been protectores. For instance, the Tetrarch Maximinus Daia had served as a protector. We're told by Lactantius in the Mortibus Persecutorum 19:6. The same Constantius Chlorus, the father of Constantine himself, who later became Caesar in the first tetrarchy, had been a protector, we're told by the anonymous Valesianus 1-2 in this case. In the 4th century, when the new Constantinian army had been affirmed, as you know, this army was not just an ideation of Constantine per se, but it was the one that had gradually consolidated after the 3rd century crisis and further institutionalized as such by rulers like Diocletian. Constantine seems is historiographically attributed with the greater military reform of the system, but we don't know precisely. In any case, these were people who knew what we're doing, also in sanctioning such new order. And in fact, in the Constantinian era, the rank of protector was integrated into the new military hierarchies, while still serving as a stepping stone to operational commands. So they weren't just brought to the top per se. There was a new career, a new cursus that allowed such officers to become protectores, and doing so through a specific experience that was spent also for these higher ranks. Ammianus 37:3, who, as we'll see now, was actually a protector himself, describes in the aforementioned passage the career of the father of Valentinian I, who, after having been a protector, was appointed as tribunus or commander of units, subsequently becoming the comes Africae and later the comes Britanniarum. I made a video again about the Notitia Dignitatum. You can find what this provincial commands were about for Africa and Britain. This is naturally very interesting because it shows how this is really typical for the protectors, that they could be appointed with such special extra task and condition before acquiring higher ranks, right? Or exactly in order to get them, like in this case, the one of tribunus, that could be, in fact, could have not been covered before, and or, as we will see, especially from Diocletian times, mirrored the sense that now it wasn't much about having a post, a commission for a certain type of officialty with a unit and all, but essentially your person, once having had this tribunician status, for example, would maintain it even if he had not received a unit under his command, because he was that qualified, and or also in a broader social, not just military sense, had acquired the status that would necessarily maintain and even transmit to his offspring, as we will see now, that would be included within the protectores units that started being formed at certain levels, especially in the imperial guard, thus more or less indicating the gold standard of such position. The tasks assigned to the protectores, that as we've seen were conceived in a quite flexibly capable way in the Constantinian era, encompassed various operational areas that often extended beyond service in the presence of the emperor. These responsibilities, we know it mostly from the Theodosian code, could include the supervision of ports and the suppression of smuggling. This is, for example, the case of Theodosian Code 7.16.3. You have the pursuit of draft dodgers and deserters, 7.22.2, the regulation of traffic and commerce as a sort of police force, 8.5.30, and the escorting of important figures of foreign embassies. We know that this is from Ammianus 1. It's important because you understand how trusted these individuals were, how many different capacities they had. They were essentially experienced soldiers with vast, say, skills and competences that could be put at the service of the emperor, the regional commanders, the local communities, really as ad hoc tasks. Ones that needed a certain iron fist, as we've seen here, repressing rebellions, destroying criminal organizations, escorting, like taking care at least of the escort of notable individuals, Roman and foreign alike, so incredibly interesting characters with a very shaded profile. And although these tasks were significant, their generic nature, along with the expanding scope of the rank of protector that we just witnessed to individuals operating so in a provincial context, for example, likely contributed in the early part of the 4th century to the emergence of yet another role, the one of the domestic protectores. This obviously speaks of the domus of the emperor, and so a sort of guard unit drawn exactly from these men. This was an even more and more properly elite group, destined to undertake tasks of even higher importance, which were more closely aligned with the needs of the emperor, and really at levels of also espionage, counter-espionage, and more that we can only imagine. Unfortunately, also because say literature is taking some sort of ever more encomiastic turn. Say we do not know as much as certain other contexts in the past. Everything is a bit more literally behind the scenes in this essentially Byzantine world. That is also the one from which the protectores are more documented. From the West we start having less. However, even this domestic protectores of the imperial domus, as an alternative to their responsibilities in the presence of the emperor, could still be assigned either temporarily or more permanently to a high-ranking commander, such as Magister Militum, for missions of particular significance, which could be even more conventionally military ones, of course. However, these men were so qualified that in many ways they had their role of advisors, of counselors. They would take care of special operations, things of this kind. And in such cases, when a domestic protector was sent by the emperor to a specific provincial commander, such domestici took on the title, right, defined by probably their mission, of deputies. We know this from the Theodosian Code 624-5, which, as you understand, disciplines literally also the military affairs. You know that we talk about it in the history about medieval law, that obviously necessitates a great focus, especially on the Theodosian and Justinian Code. This was really the basis, in fact, for the latter, right? And that reflects beautifully. In fact, 5th century, essentially late 4th situation that had come, if you want, even to be a bit crystallized by that point, so that we can properly see what kind of role these protectores had. We know less, for example, about probably the early 4th century. At this point, the protectores have become an ever more defined and sort of more specific and regulated officialty. Before, it hadn't been like that. As we've seen, these guys were drawn literally from some of the lowest ranks of the officialty. Thus, they were also a bit more disposable, especially ever since the military hierarchy was sort of less, it was more rigid actually than it would have become later, at least when these men were under that more rigid hierarchy that at this later point, sort of more Byzantine era, had turned into, yes, there was a much more oligarchic society, but these individuals could did have an important weight within the same imperial household. They could act a bit in a more influential way, also behind the scenes. Ammianus Marcellinus, we said it before, was himself a protector domesticus, so exactly one of those household protectores assigned to the Magister Equitum per Orientem, Ursicinus, during the Sasanian Wars of Constantius II. Ammianus worked alongside a group of his colleagues, and some tribuni vacantes, which refers to officers who held the rank of tribunus but did not exercise actual command over a unit. This is also very interesting because it shows how there were different types of officers, including the old tribuni maintained in the Roman army at this point had, of course, still Latin, also in the East, that would speak mostly Greek, still like official names of the ranks, etc. And these tribuni were people who had literally been tribuni by extraction, by commission, but that at this point didn't have, in this specific moment in their personal life, didn't have a command. However, being so important as skilled military personnel to be needed, right, and employed as a sort of task force, also of intelligence, not necessarily a direct command on the field, that could help the broader effort. Ammian lists a variety of tasks characteristic of the protectores, often of considerable significance and carried out personally. Right? Naturally, these people had men under their command, but they could act literally in some liberty and autonomy. They had green light for a lot of sort of not on parchment thing that they were commissioned specifically. Military tasks, that remains for sure, particularly those related to the overall reorganization of the fortified defenses in Mesopotamia. In Ammianus' case, because he's talking about the ones, as we've seen in the East, that he was more aware of, together with the direct management of besieged locations. This is, in fact, 18679. But also political tasks such as the removal of internal adversaries and usurpers, 14.9 and 15.5. Naturally, these people were not provided with particular mercy inclination. However, the first function is interesting, as one could draw a parallelism with the equites singularis that we will come to make a video soon. It is scheduled for at least some time from now. That pertain to a specific military engineering training. The education, in that case, we're much better informed. Here the protectores are, as we've seen, a bit more randomly picked, but the kind of experience that they had matured during their career, like in this case, entailed also military administration, military engineering, logistics, during siege warfare, so those were very and highly technical business that really required quite advanced and specific skills. Naturally, assassinations, coups, attacks, etc., those were part of even a wider set of capacities that entailed unavoidably a political connection and support, etc. Obviously, these men did not literally work alone. They had all a net of intelligence behind them. They knew what they were doing at so many levels, but they could be pretty shady figures, as you understand themselves. Ultimately, the importance of the corps of protectores lay not only in the broader spectrum of tasks to which its members could be assigned, but also in its function of cultivating an estate of skilled and competent officers in the field. That never comes less. These are primarily commanders, and they know how to fight out there. in the open. These officers would eventually assume direct command of a unit. Normally that was their more common commission, and often pursue high-ranking careers in the late imperial general staffs, so commanding like entire regional forces, and therefore being some of the, say, more mentally fit individuals for this task, which is very specific. We have seen it also in the Krieg. Like there is a very narrow number of human beings that is capable of doing what commanders in the highest positions do. Right? They have the control, the granitic control of themselves, have a massive ego that destabilizes the situation under some of the direst of circumstances. They have this massive shoulders capable of carrying this immense moral burden, and they also have all the set of determination, etc., that must come with command at the higher levels. Ammianus provides a vivid snapshot of these processes. After the successful elimination of the usurper Silvanus, his group of protectores domestici and tribuni vacantes at the same time was divided. In fact, the younger members remained with Ursicinus, while the more experienced individuals were promoted in rank and received commands. Right? This is what we get from Ammianus' personal experience within the system. The connection between the figure of the emperor and the protectores, both the domestici but also others, is evident through such quasi-feudal practices that were developing. Here it's documented by the Theodosian Code, so we are in fact in that moment of greater crisis, contraction, and the world is really taking another turn, and that also show how the protectores rank was acquired. We're talking about the ritual known as the adoratio of the purpur, the adoratio purpurae. During this ceremony, the candidate was required to pay homage to the Augustus by kissing the edge of his purple robe. Consider that the proskynesis was not a thing until Domitian's times, nor it would be fully be adopted until Trajan's. At this point, especially in the eastern part of the empire, such adoration of the Augustus was required properly to enter as an initiatic proof of obedience, respect, deference to, in fact, what was tendentially, especially in the Byzantine world, still flirted with, in theory, with the divinity of not just the imperium, but properly the divinity of the emperor. This is something that, of course, would not be fully expressed in now, in fact, with Theodosius himself. Theodosius II, telling the truth, because this is the times of the grandson of he who established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, and so having the church watching over the imperial claims as well. But as you know, the Byzantine world would maintain with specific titling, etc., properly the Augustan nature of the emperor, at least in this formal, but yet still ambiguous sense, because it couldn't be fully stated. And so with actually a much greater control on the church than on the West, but also ending up to sclerotize society in ways that, in fact, wouldn't allow to the continuation of the empire, at least much later from this. At this point, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was, as you know, very powerful, albeit suffering. And that's why I was saying before, just like the West, really, there were extremely similar and contemporary issues that both were facing, and it's not like it was a deterministic certainty of or just from our side to think that these had to survive because it was better placed, they had more money. This is not much the issue. There were moments in which the thing could really collapse, as much as it happened in the West, that also had chances not to collapse. However, things indeed also went the way they did, because of a different reality that is mirrored exactly also by this. Of course, this was done in the West as well, but and regarding here the imperial nature of the rulers, but in many ways also among the Federati, for example, recognizing an ever more, in fact, evident divinity of the rulers in a society was ever more stratifying everywhere, right? From the Romans to the Germans, with kings rising, for example, in the Germanic world, essentially made by the Romans, their own imperial image, or at least royal, still subordinated one, but within their own people. I talked about this also recently regarding the Germanic imperial Catholic miracle. The point here is that there is a personal connection between the protector and the emperor that must be certified by such act of complete devotion, as far as earthly and part non-earthly affairs are concerned. These men are now dependent. This wear an oath, of course, as always, but they also have properly to kiss the edge of the purple robe. That, of course, represents that veritable divinity of the empire. This was codified by Theodosius II, so it's literally a practice that already existed and that had been generalized, especially for this kind of troops that had to not just serve the emperor in the palace, which was obvious, but also were trusted with some of the riskiest and most, consequential missions to execute. A lengthy and challenging career within the ranks was not the only pathway to join the protectores domestici. Those of noble lineage had the opportunity to secure such position through a recommendation from an influential figure, even without substantial experience in the field. This was also codified by Theodosian times. In fact, from the Code 624.3 we learn of this, signifying that this is also typical of the Byzantine court at a point. Like, of course, the emperor had a greater power, could simply appoint this or that individual to this or that office at his will, and he didn't, of course, have to answer to anyone. He made multiple videos explaining properly how this balance really was, since Constantinian, the foundation of the Constantinian Senate of Constantinople as an institution, how it was regulated in a very different way from the Roman Senate that was truly composed of very powerful oligarchs that sort of obliged the same emperors to move east and create, in fact, a senate of almost bureaucrats to a degree. Of course, there were landowners, powerful people, but let's say there was also a way to balance things up and reducing, in fact, the same senatorial power as a consequence. The same was true for the church. So in the East, you find this would have happened to an important degree. In the West, of course, as well, this favoritism, recommendations that occurred, especially as far as this imperial house posts were concerned, right? The protectores were not infinite. They were part of the guard, fundamentally, at this point, and as such, they could host within their ranks particularly chosen people that, as we've seen, and this is what the protectores would maintain for a while, were not necessary to have even passed through a specific promotion through the ranks, right? It could even come to command in fact, more experienced soldiers, commanders, simply by appointment. Plus, there is another aspect, a law enacted in 364, collected by the Codex Theodosianus 624-2, that mandated that the children and closest relatives of the protectores domestici must be integrated into the same corps prior to puberty, even if they were still unfit for combat, as likely occurred in the case of Ammianus Marcellinus himself. What does this mean? As we were talking about also in the videos about Diocletian, the Capitatio Iugatio, the increase, let's say, in the social immobility, for the sake of a greater, at least initially, civil commitment to the role. Like if you were the son of a soldier, you had to become a soldier, right? If you were otherwise born as a peasant, as a colonist, let's say, you had to remain under your lord's control in that land, and you had to be registered and surveilled and so on. So everything was turning, as we are exposing but different indicators of what we know a bit better, like feudal society, the early medieval world. Some people say that Constantine initiated that in a way with a solid system. There are lots of historiographical interpretations when and how to categorize such passage, but it's definitely a world in which connections count more. There is a greater social stratification. There is a let's say a much more hierarchical system. The idea being that there is something also biological, genetic, connected with lineage properly, that in the blood connects you with your ancestors and office that they owned, so that you basically had to follow in their footsteps. So once you were inside the system, you couldn't quite get out of that. This is that important also because if you are literally the son of a protector, surely you've been hearing in your milieu lots of interesting stories, politically speaking, stories that someone wouldn't like you to tell, and you would be trusted to a degree of being part of this elite, right? This was a privileged order that also entailed being paid handsomely and maintained to an important degree, and so being part, in the case of the domestici especially, of a courtly world, but as we've seen in the case of the protectores in general, just being part of an upper estate of individuals that were at least expected, like were rewarded in part also in this way for the settlement of their children and so on. This is important because just as the army gets ever more landed, connected with the local natural resources through the unknown, etc., at an elite level, this settlement is achieved by, in fact, consolidating, sort of checking the status and remaining within that rank. So it's incredibly important. It's a business in which you can get into also for particular ability, given that you're chosen exactly from the ranks of the army that still exists at a important level structurally, systemically, with all an officialty, a hierarchy, various ranks from which you can pick again quite interesting individuals. Always bear in mind that the highest command posts, the military careers, were ever more revolving around the court in general. This is especially true in Constantinople, but it's something which socially is happening in the Roman Empire and beyond in very concrete ways. In the 5th century, serving in the protectores even conferred the rank of vir clarissimus, which equated to the entrance into the senatorial order. This is yet another proof of the consolidation of a loyal following from the imperial side that, in a sense, is bringing back these military careers to a sort of civilian dimension, right? Yes, these people were still tied to the army and those political military functions, but at the same time we're entering now this other step of the privileged order to become landowners of some important level that they had somewhat already been, also because to rise through the ranks you also can use those say that support not everyone through the Roman say that has risen through the ranks has done so just out of merit, right? In any circumstance in general you find always this political and social dynamics at play. This equates of course also to gradual stabilization of the same Byzantine system in particular. The 5th century is definitely this moment still of crisis but also of settlement around the very fundamentals of the Byzantine world already founded by Constantine, but at this point being ever more characteristics for the social political balance that will remain typical of Constantinople. So being part of the Protectores first, especially the Domestici, and then becoming a Virclarissimus in the Senate of Constantinople. Here we're looking also at the west of Ravenna, of Rome, but in general would confer you some a condition, a status that would go beyond the one of a military man in this sense. The 10 highest ranking protectores and the 10 domestic ones within the hierarchy were granted the aforementioned honor of viri clarissimi, along with the one of primiceri. So this the highest operational rank documented for the protectores as such. We know it from the Theodosian Code 624 and 624.10 specifically, which was an even more civilian office. This was used in administration. By the way, it's important here to stress such cursus because, as you know from Diocletian, not just there had been this consolidation of professional inheritance, if you want, but the military and civilian careers had been ever more differentiated. As we said at the beginning, we've seen in the videos about again the early imperial Roman chain of command. Of course, the Roman magistracies were a mix of civilian military power that they didn't even distinguish too strictly from, at least in a theological sense, but also because some civilian offices did have a degree of imperium, some particular functions, even minor ones compared to the general magistracy, as range of powers that, however, allowed to use force, violence, and so you have the consul embodying mostly that, but even the quaestor has some imperial power, authority at his disposal. In later Roman times, even though the connections are getting somewhat more private, there is a steeper divide between the military and the civilian order. Right, so this tendency during the 5th century of seeing the protectores getting titles like the one of Primicerius, Vir Clarissimus, is definitely the proof that they were going beyond their initial military background that, in Constantinian times, would have been at the peak, also during the 3rd century crisis, for what their true military competences were appreciated for. And so you see that there is a gradual tendency also to employ them in, especially as they were being extracted from a case rather than from the ranks, literally, in a competitive sense, were maybe better in the civilian administration, like politics probably meant, rather than being strictly military professionals, technicians, or quite specialized individuals. The same privilege of primicerius was awarded to those protectores who were promoted to the esteemed rank of praepositum laborum, designated with the task of carrying the emperor's own banner in battle, which naturally was an enormous honor and required quite representative political face, not just a military one. Then would be, of course, the adequate military personnel connected with the protector in this case, that was surely also a military competent person in the way he was chosen, but still receiving that also as an incentive of trust. I mean, this is literally the guy that can act behind the scenes, but it's supposed to be trusted properly with the imperial band. So it must be the single most loyal person ever. This provision is to be found in the Theodosian Code 625.1. So we see a quite variegated and charismatic role that the protector, at least at the highest levels, has achieved. It becomes more of a more fixed courtly and military figure in the highest ranks. That was really not the case before, for they were exceptionally put above those who they had not reached in the normal courses through rising through the ranks. Now they are literally a thing on their own. While the general protectores reported directly still to the magistre militum, the protectores domestici were in fact commanded by a comes domesticorum, which thus was beyond the regional commander that controlled the cavalry, the infantry. In fact, they had cavalrymen and infantrymen on their own. The earliest mention of a comes domesticorum dates back to 346, Theodosian Code 12.138. By the early 5th century, each half of the empire had officially a comes domesticorum equitum and a comes domesticorum peditum, which means that, of course, this force was part of the imperial guard to a degree, the emperor's very own. Of course, also a significant tactical segmentation and organization. This would have been, again, equipped with the best panoplies, armed with the finest arms and armor. Also, so we have the comes domesticorum, under him the comes domesticorum equitum, the comes domesticorum peditum. Naturally, their function was commanding respectively the domestici equitas and the domestici peditas. So there's an elaborate command structure here, and naturally tactical interaction, completion, that are all under a single command. We know this from the Notitia Dignitatum, by the way. The comes domesticorum was a vir illustris. He had already secured that position. He may have not probably even been protector to begin with. So were the magistri, however, to whom he was hierarchically subordinate. So in theory, at least, there was at least the possibility of the various magistri having a control, and this is kind of obvious in battle, for example, over the domestici, because these were simply not enough. They were an elite force, so they were not, however, to be employed outside of the general one, right? They had to be commanded also by people who knew what were doing. Not necessarily, again, the idea that command could be both and all these things is surely brought to like in all eras to issues in the military. However, there had to be outside the domestic space of the imperial household, of course, a military employee of these troops, under a broader command of a field army, for example. And the comes domesticorum's role must have been significant in the field as well, however. For example, Ammianus mentions at least 3 comites domesticorum dispatched by their respective emperors to handle complex situations on site. This, of course, reflects the fact that the protectores were employed just for military roles at a strategic and tactical level that required such distinguished and often surgical attention. According to Claudian, an author who died in 404, Ammianus, he was born around the 30s of the 4th century, died the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century. Claudian was in fact a contemporary of his. In his Laus Serenae 196-201, tells us that Stilicho, right, who definitely was a very competent commander, he beat the Visigoths time after time, playing essentially cat with mouse, and in that sense showing you also how politically, as you know, there is all the criticism for which he was eventually killed, that there was something political ambitious in letting the Goths run after they actually had been cornered, had been boxed. Stilicho, well, while still a comes domesticorum, that's where he had come from as well, possessed superior authority in the field compared to the magistri, whichever they were, peditum, equitum, militum, etc., despite being inferior in rank and age to them. This is a great example of how, of course, it isn't much like the category of troop, whether you were protector or not, but whether if you were a capable, successful individual, both politically and military, you could simply obtain these roles before others who at least came formally in line. And consider that Stilicho was the son of a Vandal cavalry officer and a provincial woman of Roman birth. So in this case, we're looking at the peaks of the empire that definitely Stilicho embodies from in terms of military rank. That can reach as far, in fact, even from not technically having been like entirely part of the system. Here, of course, we don't know too much about the background, but it's obvious that if we look at the origin of many protectores, most of whom, of course, would remain as a sort of troop if they were part of the domestici, right? We have to distinguish here 2 periods. We understand that they could be also of humble origin without, in fact, too much authority being entrusted. As we have seen in today's video, you have a beginning which the protector is, yes, someone that can be entrusted with special missions at different levels, but that has fundamentally risen through the ranks and is some sort of soldier that eventually becomes an officer. Later, you have something else. You have someone who's more part of an estate, of a social rank, that can be either a great officer or most frequently just part of this broader troop, such as the domestici, that would thus be just finely ranked guardsmen, but not necessarily provided individually with any specific, any other specific requirement, if not, for example, having been the child of one soldier, maybe of the same kind of quality, by the way. So it's this mirrors that sort of crystallization of society that definitely occurs in late antiquity, and that especially will be characteristic of the Byzantine world over time. And naturally, we have already talked about other contexts in which this was true. We have to talk about it, but more for the Germans, for example, how important it was, for example, to be part of a clan that historically had, I don't know, been there autonomous in the Barbaricum and literally butchering their way through the enemy, and that eventually when settled through the Hospitalitas and part of a Romano-Germanic kingdom would become sort of landed nobility. And so just because you were the child of one of these people, you were expected just to continue being the same kind of warrior, but in a different type of also political landscape that would have required more, in fact, also more administrative civilian capacity rather than just being merely a warrior, even though the political and social landscape could be so privatized and sort of deteriorated publicly and civilly that things would get down to arms more frequently than not. However, this is in fact the point of these societies. You have to understand who produced them, who were the people rising to the ranks from the 3rd to the 5th century. Really, a lot of things happened. And I'm glad we managed to talk about the protectores because they are definitely a very important litmus indicator of such change over the centuries. And so figures of markedly interesting and sort of high profile, also behind the scene, quite skilled character that however becomes some sort of more regularized officiality and or even just civilian officers at some point, because it's not like they would maintain literally always this protector's original say condition status forever, right? In the Byzantine world, in the West, well, the system falls, and it would be interesting, but unfortunately we don't have the sources to see how these military men maintain a place also in the Romano-Germanic world. But there is a case of this for units where we're told by Procopius, by other authors, that they survived later on. But also in that case, they blended eventually with the rest. And a bit this is true for the Byzantine world. That remains a bit more fixed in terms of like that state survives, that those offices remain, but they are also changing over time. There is a meaning that fundamentally different. Think about primicerius, right? We've seen being given to the protectores in some exceptional cases. Well, in that case, you know that these titles sort of change meaning and function over time. So unfortunately, we aren't able to check on this. We just see that at a certain point, these titles disappear and or they're eventually referred to other contexts. The protectores mostly have this this kind of this is the height, per se, of their importance, but they are the product, in fact, of their own time. We will hopefully keep looking at this more in detail at some other point, applied to some other also to other troops, guard units, for example. That's important. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.